All right, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and start reading if that's all okay with you guys. And lately, as you all know, we've been reading The Shadow on the Glass by Jonathan Howard. In case you forgot, I know it's been a couple weeks, but we're back on track and we're starting again with chapter 8. Up until this point, I'll go ahead and give us a recap since we've been on a minor hiatus. But recently, William Grant lost his best friend Lizzie in a seance gone wrong, and what came back was not, in fact, his friend Lizzie, but is a interdimensional being, and he has recently found out this fact after being drugged and taken on a weird drug trip slash mental manipulation by some interdimensional intergalactic cosmic deity. So he's having a great time. He's understanding a lot of things beyond his comprehension normally. And the main thing is that we are all in great danger. The human race might become extinct, and we have to go fight an Australian guy named Sir Donovan Clay. We're going to have a great time doing it. And if we do it, then we might get Lizzie back. And that's what William sees. That's what William's motivations are. And that's where we left off. And that's what you missed on Glee. So, with that, I'm going to start chapter 8. Okay. Chapter 8. Worlds Enough in Time. Grant needed to stop thinking if he wanted to get anything done, but it was hard to avoid dwelling on Lizzie and the terrible trial she was currently undergoing unaccountable millennia in the past. It was easier not to think of how he had stopped viewing time as a river one bobbed along like a cork, but now rather saw it as that limitless meadow, all simultaneous and perceivable should one's eyes be opened sufficiently wide. Miss Church had assured him that the drug she had employed upon him, I truly am a nurse, was not addictive and had hinted that it was neither a product of the present nor actually a drug in the sense that a pharmacologist might recognize. That might be true. Indeed, given the enormity of what he now expected to comprehend, it would be fatuous to lie on such a point, but he found he still craved the clarity it had brought to him. Now that his mind was a small place again, it was difficult to take such truths in. But now he knew what sort of body the current occupant of Elizabeth Whittle's corpus vivant owned back in the oh-so-distant past, and that was currently inhabited by Lizzie. The great cone, the clawed tentacles, the head like a scientific instrument made from the flesh of fish. He hoped that those who were looking after her were keeping her well sedated. He could hardly imagine what it might be like to realize oneself not only in the wrong body, but the body of a creature that would not look out of place in the deepest reaches of the oldest ocean. The idea of the creature lay etched in cognitive mercury in his mind. If he tried to think about it too hard, it ran over the cobbles of his thoughts to reform elsewhere, refusing close scrutiny. He assumed this was an effect of the drug, and he was glad of it. The idea thus existed in the parts of his memory occupied by all that was mundane and acceptable, like pavement bollards and pub signs, known but generally unremarked. The same could be said of how the knowledge had been communicated to him in the first place. The memory of the creature was too vivacious to have been conveyed by speech, or even a good picture. It was more as if he had once encountered at least one example, and strolled by it as if it were a horse or a dog. If he wondered too hard at how he knew such a strange form, how he was familiar with its odd gliding lumber and the serpentine coiling of those clawed, boneless arms, he would have been at a loss. And then the ramifications would have crowded in upon him, but that never happened, for the recollection fell into beads of quicksilver even as he tried to grasp it. and ran away to reform somewhere else. It was a relief to remain in such artful ignorance, and he could only hope that a similar kindness had been extended to Lizzie, wherever she was. A lot of things made a great deal more sense now that they had been explained, even if many elements of those explanations had been quietly filed away by his mind into secret corners under covers reading, "To be accepted without question." Questioning them, after all, necessitated thinking about them, and that might well be unwise. Better to let them reside in the shadows at the back of his awareness. Better and safer. One of the safer elements was the provenance of Miss Church. Emerging from the cellar in which he had undergone his ordeal of the eons, Grant had found himself in the servants' hall of a small villa that he subsequently learned was in a quiet cul-de-sac in Chiswick. Chiswick? Chiswick? It's quiet here and people keep to themselves, said Miss Church. How on earth did you spirit me from Kensington to Chiswick? In a furniture delivery van wrapped in a carpet, said a new voice. Grant looked over to see a familiar young man hovering by the back door. I'm very sorry about the business in the alleyway, sir, he said, giving every indication that he was prepared to bolt like a skittish cat if Grant made a move towards him. I thought you meant the master harm. He means me, said Miss Trent, coming through the door from the body of the house. Mr. Grant, this is Mr. Robert Castle. I see, said Grant, unconsciously reaching up to smooth back his hair and thereby touching the small wound Castle had bestowed upon him. And who might Mr. Robert Castle be? One of us, said Miss Church, a concerned party and a member of our little society. And what sort of society is that? The secret sort. The neighbors think we are some sort of friendly society, and we make some efforts to support the misapprehension. But actually, we're sort of She paused, considering. A sort of. Her eyebrows went up to denote mild surprise, as if she had never thought in quite such terms before that moment. A sort of cult, I suppose. A nice sort of cult, added Mr. Castle. Oh, yes, nothing frightful or sordid. Certainly a nice cult. The drug had, Grant realized, not preserved his sanity so much as selectively broken it in such a way that they might have been discussing the best damson jam recipe than a cult hidden among the burrows of Hounslow. If there was anything that might have sent him raving into the night, and he could see that night had fallen through the high windows of the servants' hall, it was that this nest of occult conspiracy was in a leafy suburb of Chiswick. At some level, he had always known that Chiswick was up to something. I think, he said, that I very much need a cup of tea. Tea was forthcoming, and the party withdrew to a more salubrious sitting room in the body of the house. Here, Grant was invited to ask his questions, and after taking a minute to sort the mountain of his curiosity into a more tractable prospect, he began. Sir Donovan Clay. Rich, yes, he's that. Eccentric, undoubtedly. A self-absorbed ass, assuredly. But these are charges that might be laid at the doors of many hundreds of Londoners. How is he the match or worse of the devil? Sir Donovan Clay is a traitor, said Castle. To the entire human race, added Miss Trent. He has made discoveries that it would be better that no human ever had. But in the immensity of time and given the curiosity of humans, it was almost inevitable that it would occur again and again. Historically, this has always been the case up to this point. People discovered this thing, they were killed by it, and equilibrium was restored. But Sir Donovan lives, said Grant. Indeed, he thrives, and that is because he is parlayed with those that would exterminate us. Mr. Castle, the map, please. Castle took a rolled up map from a cluster of others atop a bureau and spread it out upon the table, weighing its corners with bric-a-brac. Grant read the legend, Western Extents of Australasia. Miss Trent pointed at part of the great yellow extent that covered much of the land. This is the Great Sandy Desert, and approximately here is where Sir Donovan's mining concern is based. She tapped the paper with one gloved fingertip. She hesitated, looking at her hand for a moment, and Grant thought of Lizzie. It is also the location of a city we sealed in antiquity, a city containing a baleful threat. You have to understand, said Castle, that Miss Whittle's tenant. Good God, said Miss Church under her breath, is not of this earth. Space is vast and more populated than even the most optimistic astronomers might guess. They came here a long time ago, staggeringly long time ago. I think Mr. Grant has enough to absorb without dragging cosmology into matters, said Miss Church. That depends on Mr. Grant, said Miss Trent, looking up from the map to regard him intently. You already know more than almost anyone on Earth does of this matter, she said directly to Grant. Some absorb such knowledge easily, others less so. You do not need to know every detail to be of assistance to me, and thereby hasten the return of Elizabeth Whittle, you know. At the same time, I will not withhold anything that you do need to know. You have a phrase, ignorance is bliss. Do you wish to remain in such blissful, if now partial, ignorance? Or do you wish me to tell you everything? Grant drew a deep breath, held it for a long moment, and then gave it a slow, fatalistic vent. I suppose I'm quite mad now, anyway, though I've always been told the mad don't think themselves mad. That is probably true now. I don't feel mad, only that I am taking part in some grand and absurd practical joke, and the masks will come off soon enough, but then again, I don't really believe that either. He smiled ruefully. Perhaps I am mad, after all. For example, I now think of you as Miss Cerulia Trent, even though Lizzie and I created Miss Cerulia Trent out of whole cloth over a pot of tea. Please don't take offense, but I would like nothing more than for Miss Cerulia Trent to become merely a fictional character played by Lizzie Whittle once again, and I shall learn everything I need to learn to hasten that event, and to help me understand what she's been through when she's restored. I take no offense to that, because it is what I desire too, William Grant, said Miss Trent. As do all my race, and as would your race too, if they only knew what awaited them after we fail. Very well, then. This is the nub of the matter. As Mr. Castle has intimated, began Miss Cerulia Trent, my people are not of Earth. Our original home is lost to us in the eons, long since left, long since forgotten. We are nomads of space and of time. The great race of Yith, they called themselves without obvious irony, even if who or what or where Yith had been was a datum obscure even to them. Perhaps it was the name of the world upon which they had first evolved, but perhaps it was not. Shorn of definitive meaning, they were simply coming to call themselves the Gith, or the Githians, because names are only labels, and those were as good as any. Certainly, a racial name is of lower importance than a personal name. And here Grant was reminded of the shower of colors he'd experienced, the most glorious firework display that was the true name of Cerulean Trent, of the personality and history it carried. The Yith she was a hero and the best chance of the Yith to survive the foreshadowed apocalypse in their future. In the distant past, then, the Yith, intelligences without form, had abandoned some other world and come to primordial Earth, there to occupy the bodies of creatures that were as terrestrial as the dinosaurs or man, that were blessed to be on the cusp of true intelligence, yet doomed to suffer an early extinction because they never quite got that chance. It was a moment ripe for the Yith, and they took it with alacrity, taking on new forms as a human might adopt a hat. Illumined with the ancient intelligence of the Yith, the fated extinction never occurred, and the Yith prospered in their new bodies, great conical creatures of thin chitin and dense hydrostatic skeletons. They raised cities and continued their cultural and scientific evolution untroubled, yet mindful of the other creatures of the earth, and always careful to avoid imposing their presence too strongly for fear of pushing the engine of nature from its ordained path. For they were cognizant of the future in the same way that a man upon a hilltop is cognizant of the land ahead, and while every detail was not easy to make out, it allowed them to see most major events that lay in the offing. But they did not anticipate the enemy, a race that had never troubled to give itself a name. The enemy tumbled around the cosmos like rambunctious, wicked children in a bone china shop, fueled by boiled sweets and their own spite. They left destruction, chaos, and the ruination of whole worlds in their wake. Great bulks of what any other species would call tumorous growths, but that it pleased them to regard as their bodies. The enemy looked with greedy eyes upon the earth, and determined to take it from the Yith. They swept down, and passages through which they traveled gaped open in the skies like diseased stomata, disgorging the enemy in their thousands. The engulfing war was fought without quarter on both sides once it became apparent that the concepts of both mercy and taking prisoners were alien to the enemy. The Yith lost city after city to the invaders, including the great capital of Nicotis. Finally, they developed new weapons, terrifying devices that threw gouts of directed lightning against which the enemy were helpless. The tide of war changed definitively, and the enemy ceded gain after gain until they were driven back to Nicotis, and then down into the labyrinth of caves beneath it. There, the triumphant Yith sealed the entrances containing the enemy and leaving them to die miserably in the darkness. But the enemy did not draw their sustenance from food and drink, and so they did not die, but only lay in the great shadowed caverns and festered in their hatred of the great race of Yith. This city, Nicotis, yes. This wouldn't be the one in Australia you mentioned, would it? What do you think? Said Mr. Castle in an undertone, unnecessarily insolent. Miss Trent nodded while Miss Church shot Mr. Castle a glance every bit as withering as a bolt from a Yithian lightning gun. It is, but our interest in it and Sir Donovan were the result of other developments. Might I continue? Grant indicated that she might do so, and so she did. The Yith could see the future, the past, and even a hint of what might have been to either side of them in the great meadow of time. Perhaps in no crystalline detail, but well enough to know when major events might threaten them. Even the arrival of the enemy had been foreseen, although their exact nature and the resistance to those weapons the Yith had immediately available came as unwelcome surprises. With the remnants of the enemy force entombed beneath Nicotis, the Yith looked forward to a future that they believed they understood well. At some moment around 60 million years in Grant's past, but still millennia into the future of the Yith, a new and long-awaited threat would emerge, and this one they would not be able to defeat. Consequently, they had not even tried, but had instead evolved a new plan. After humanity's extinction, began Miss Trent. I beg your pardon? Said Grant, startled out of the slightly dreamlike state his mind had adopted as a safe way to absorb disturbing new data without turning to stewed cheese. You surely don't expect us to last forever, do you, old man? Said Mr. Castle. While Grant was grateful to the idea that Mr. Castle, at least, would not last forever, he had never really questioned that people would remain as the dominant species. In all likelihood, with the British Empire proving an equally immortal entity, that humanity could go the same way as the dodo was a new, unpleasant, and very personal concept. It is the way of the universe, Mr. Grant, Miss Trent said. Everything must change sooner or later. Not your lot, though, he said more hotly than intended. First sign of trouble, you can gallivant off to grab somebody else's body, you'll live forever. She shook her head. No, even in our visions of the future, there is darkness far ahead. Perhaps it is the limit of our sight, or perhaps there is nothing for us to see beyond that point. Our existence as a race may be long, but it is by no means infinite. Why, even the... She paused, and Grant thought he saw a glimmer of fear in her, flickering momentarily beneath the human face that concealed it. She rallied and instead said, But I digress. After the extinction of humanity, which was a substantial period into the future, I assure you. He found the use of the past tense less reassuring, but said nothing. A new race reached the cusp of intelligence, but suffered a catastrophe that prevented its full flowering. Again, just like your current forms, it happens frequently. The opportunity to reach full sapience is the rarity. And as a matter of interest, what creatures are these? The monkeys? Mr. Castle laughed. We're the monkeys, old chap. Sort of cockroaches, I've been given to understand, supplied Miss Church. Rather big ones. She saw Grant's consternation. Sorry. That has long been the anticipated next great exodus of my race. We also saw that the containment of the enemy could not last forever, but that they would only escape long after we had escaped to the future and long, long before our arrival. Cheated of their chance at revenge and the definitive knowledge that they had been defeated for all time, they would sink into a state of racial ennui and finally become extinct themselves. This was all to the good. Grant gave up trying to think of time as a meadow and returned to thinking of it more like a river, an easier concept for him to absorb. But something changed, didn't it? Miss Trent nodded slowly. That black horizon I told you of. It abruptly came much closer. How much so? It is here. It was as if overnight the Yith view of the meadow had suddenly become encroached upon by a black fog. the furthest edge of which was marked as the year 1891 Anno Domini. The great exodus of which Miss Trent had spoken was corrupted, forestalled, and foreshortened. The Yith at the moment of the exodus would find themselves unable to travel further than 1891 and be forced to occupy human bodies en masse. And then, we immediately suspected this might have something to do with the enemy, and so we asked our agents to investigate any possible resurgence. Agents, said Grant. Hello, chorused Miss Church and Mr. Castle. I did say that we are sort of a cult, added Miss Church. The Yith are explorers of time, which they manage by temporarily possessing a human host body, while the human mind occupies the Yith body in the past. They potter around for a while, gathering data, while the human mind in the past is gently questioned about their everyday life, and the current state of art, science, politics, and so on. Over the centuries, a sort of, well, I suppose you might call it a mutual aid society, has developed across the world to help the Yith in their pottering around and to aid them to return when they're done. In return, they give us a bit of scientific help and help us dodge the occasional catastrophe. It's all very equitable. It's not like we're worshipping them or anything barbaric like that. She frowned and looked at Miss Trent. You don't want to be worshipped, do you? Absolutely not, said Miss Trent. Jolly good, said Mr. Castle. So, as agents, what did you discover? Asked Grant, keener to understand the imminent threat to humanity than the niceties of running a cult that might or might not worship otherworldly entities. Miss Church glanced to Miss Trent again, this time for tacit permission to take up the tale. Well, the first thing to do was to check on the state of Nicotis, and to our horror, we discovered a mining operation had been built on the site. We thought we'd forestalled anything like that by using our influence to make the area off limits as a government reserve. But apparently, Donovan Clay, as he was then, greased a few palms and worked his way past the restriction. We did what we could, but he had found higher alumina bauxite deposits, and what with the Bayer process being perfected a few years ago, well, you can imagine. Grant had little concept of what bauxite was, regardless of its alumina content, and he was sure that he'd never heard of the Bayer process, but it all seemed very clever and the sort of thing likely to involve large sums of money. So he nodded shrewdly and hoped that no one would ask him to explain any of this. So we stood by, said Mr. Castle, or at least our counterparts in Perth did. The Australian Perth, that is. They waited for the inevitable moment when Nicotis would be discovered, or worse yet, the enemy released. But it never seemed to happen. We thought it might have when operations were suspended for a week, and we stood by, sure that reports of strange flying monsters and mass casualties would soon be coming out of the desert, but nothing. We were beginning to believe that we must have entirely misunderstood the situation when we received the report that there had been an accident at the mine at the beginning of the quietus. 15 men dead, and their bodies apparently irrecoverable for examination, or at least that's what the coroner was told. In hindsight, it seems that Nicotis is discovered. The enemy is released. They killed the first people they encountered, and then, well, we believe Sir Donovan somehow negotiated with them. I thought these things didn't understand negotiation, Miss Church said. You have to bear in mind how long they have been trapped. Millions upon millions of years. They are not the enemy of old. They may still hate the great race of Yith. Indeed, by this time, our extermination is probably a point of faith to them and beyond disputation, but we do not truly know what Sir Donovan encountered in those tunnels or how he communicated with them. What we do know, however, is what he offered them. The trapping and slaughter of the great race in this year. You may imagine what he will want in return. And that's the whole of what you know? Asked Grant. The majority of it, yes, admitted Castle. So, any questions? Dozens, said Grant. To Miss Trent, he said, firstly, how does he intend to stop you traveling onwards to the future you were expecting would be yours? These cockroaches of yours. We do not know. We have never encountered a barrier thrown up in time before. It is a remarkable feat. The enemy we fought in the past were possessed of a certain cunning, but they were not clever exactly. How they could have devised such an effect is confusing. Sir Donovan couldn't have come up with it? He's supposed to be pretty clever, isn't he? Mr. Castle shook his head. He's a smart one, no doubt. But apart from being pretty lively with dynamite and blasting gelinite, he's not what you'd call the Newton of the age. As I say, the chemistry of explosives, he's your fella, but messing around with time itself? No, not him. So, it must be these enemy creatures themselves. But then I wonder, why do they need him? It's a naughty old puzzle, isn't it? Said Mr. Castle, looking inside the teapot and being disappointed to find insufficient remaining for a cup. It is a puzzle we have very little time left to solve, said Miss Trent. You know, said Grant, all through this, I've been wondering, why Lizzie? Why drop into her when nearly anyone else in that house would have been a better prospect? You've never explained that. You have to understand, Mr. Grant, that the transposition is not a perfectly accurate operation. The best we can hope for is a rough locale. We misread matters and assumed that you and Miss Whittle were members of this inner circle, that Sir Donovan had something planned for the evening. We hoped that performing the operation then would allow whatever these other activities were to obfuscate the transposition. You knew about the session. But how? Grant thought for a moment and answered himself. The cabman. He was one of yours, wasn't he? He looked at Miss Church. You and your cult are very good at barging your way into the lives of others without so much as an excuse me, aren't you? So this happening to Lizzie was just rotten luck, then? No, not entirely, said Miss Trent. There's a quality that all living creatures possess, a sort of potentiality, if you will. When we settled upon one mind out of all those there that night, it was the one with the greatest such puissance. We did so in the belief that this must be one of the leaders of the conspiracy, perhaps even Sir Donovan himself. But it was Lizzie. Alas, it was, and I apologize again at all that has befallen her and you as a result. Her mind was an incandescent light upon our instruments, Mr. Grant. Elizabeth Whittle is a remarkable woman. I already knew that, said William Grant. And that is the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9. 6 Wounds. The situation, then, was dire. There is little in life so bad, however, that it may not deteriorate further. Grant was much happier to return to Kensington Smugly middle class though it was, he did not like the environs of the Yith cult's discreet little house, and indeed, given the choice of wandering the reputably doom-haunted tunnels beneath Nicotis and the distant Antipodes, or Chiswick, he would have needed a minute to think about it. He had started to brew a pot of tea, thought better of it, broke out a bottle of whiskey, and now stood nursing a glass of a halfway decent single malt with a splash of water as he looked out of the window of Miss Trent's rooms into which the quartet had repaired. Perhaps he was growing overly on edge given recent revelations, but he had noted a man who reminded him of one of Sir Donovan's people behaving with mannered nonchalance in a doorway across the street. Now, 20 minutes later, there he remained. "I think the house is under observation," he said to the others. "I guarantee it," said Mr. Castle. "Fellow across the street. Looks like somebody poured a concoction of mussel and vinegar in a good soup and forgot to say when, One of Donovan's creatures. We should have stayed in Chiswick." Though loath to admit it, Grant felt that that was probably true. "I'm sorry about your colleague. The cabman, that is." Poor old Georgie Handful. For once, Castle didn't seem nearly so amused by life. "He's a good egg. Rotten luck that they caught him." "He may still be alive," said Miss Church. "No," said Grant. "I'm sorry, he isn't. I spoke to the police and they told me about his death and implied with impertinent gal that they thought I was involved." "Well, that's definite then," said Castle. "Ugly way to go, beaten to death by a bunch of convict spawn thugs." "No," said Grant. "That's not what happened to him. It was awful. Far worse than being beaten to death." He hesitated. "I don't wish to shock anyone."
"Oh, don't be absurd," said Miss Church. "I think that we're all rather beyond that at this point, don't you?"
Quickly, then, he gave a brief description of what he had learned in New Scotland Yard, the 6 brutal skull injuries and the removal of the brain. Despite her admonition, both Miss Church and Mr. Castle seemed nevertheless shocked.
"6 wounds,"
said Miss Trent with sudden intensity that perplexed and troubled Grant.
"equally spaced around the vault of the skull."
"Yes." Grant found himself thinking of the mortuary photographs despite his best efforts not to. "Is that significant?"
"It is. There's an excellent chance that Mr. Hanforth is not dead."
"I assure you, I saw the pictures. I didn't want to, but that swine Bradley put them before me. Your man Hanforth was the most deceased I have ever seen any man this side of an urn of ashes and walking crematorium. There was no chance of survival."
"Of his body, I agree. But you are not your body, Mr. Grant. You are your brain, and your body is merely a convenient way of conveying it around. The same was true of Mr. Hanforth. His brain may still live, and therefore so does he."
There was an awful silence from the 3 entirely human occupants of the room. "Are you saying," said Castle with care, "that Georgie Hanforth might still be alive right this moment as a brain in, I don't know, a jar somewhere?"
"Not somewhere. In the house of Sir Donovan Clay. It is a convenient form for interrogation, I would guess, depending on how much control one has of the senses, and assuming communication is possible."
"How do you know this?" said Grant with equal care. "What is the significance of the 6 incisions?"
We have considered such a form of surgery, hypothetically, for certain circumstances.
Miss Church looked at her companions.
Hypothetically, she repeated.
Oh, God, said Miss Church in a terrible whisper. Poor Georgie. Poor us, too, said Castle. They know where he knows, then they know everything. The retreat in Chiswick isn't safe. Grant shook his head. There was no one watching it, as the cul-de-sac road itself and the path to the rear, so that means they'd need at least 2 people. Just before we left, I scouted down the path to check the end wasn't observed, and then when we did leave via the front, there was nobody dawdling at the junction. Certainly no one who looked like one of St. Donovan's men. We only came under observation on returning here. And I don't understand why they did that to Georgie. If they can't get information out of him, what use is he to them? They might as well have just stuck a shiv in his back and dumped him in the Thames like any good honest Englishman would have, instead of all this baroque how-do-you-do messing about with the fella's tuppenny. Miss Church looked blankly at him, so he added, a knife. Stuck a knife in him.
I was actually wondering what a tuppenny might be.
Head, supplied Grant. It's rhyming slang. Leaving Miss Church very much at sea as to how tuppenny might possibly rhyme with head, he continued, I don't suppose there's any chance that it was done for the pure brutality of the act.
No, said Miss Trent. At the very least, it was performed as an experiment. At the worst, they may be able to extract some information from him. That possibility means that we have no choice but to act swiftly. Sir Donovan must be stopped before he's able to complete whatever the enemy's plan entails.
The business with the session. Seance, you mean? Asked Castle. We never liked that term, but what was it for? Surely Sir Donovan wouldn't take a rest from betraying humanity to these creatures to mourn his wife, would he? I've seen enough grieving husbands to know he didn't give a tuppenny damn about losing his wife. In fact, in light of what you've told me, the coincidence of his wife dying just before he left Australia seems to grow less and less likely.
Oh, said Miss Church. I hadn't considered that. Surely even he. She shook her head. But of course he would. No crime is beyond him.
Castle frowned. I don't like the man either, but we can't go accusing him of every possible crime just...
He is a traitor to the entire human race, she said firmly,
and that was the end of that particular caveat. The phrase had resonance, and the room was silent for a minute or two. Grant had heard similar a few times before in his life, usually employed by the yellow press over somebody who had criticized some raw-headed and bloody-boned policy or other to which the newspaper proprietors cleaved closely. This, however, was literal and without an ounce of hyperbole upon its frame, and that realization solidified a horror upon Grant that thus far he had held at arm's length. He had met the devil, and the devil had a house out in Barking. I'm truly sorry for the loss of your friend, he said at last. He must have got lost in that wretched storm. It was coming down in stair rods that night. We could barely see where we were going.
It was not a natural storm, said Miss Trent. It hovered over the house and that house only. Something happened that night that had an effect upon the weather. I do not know what.
The lightning was fierce, admitted Grant.
Lightning,
said Castle suddenly. Oh, and all the fuss I quite forgot to mention. Georgie took the lightning weapon with him that night. I suppose that's lost now, too. Grant thought of the mighty stroke of lightning that had apparently struck the house, or close nearby. the concussion of it throwing open the French windows into that dismal dining room.
If they have it, then the enemy know that we are close to them.
Miss Trent's brow gathered in deep thought for a few seconds.
Everything must be expedited. We must move against them before they can move against us.
You have more of these things? Asked Grant. These weapons? No, said Castle. Well, not working examples. But in any case, there was an awkward pause. We're supposed to be jolly careful with them. I should hope so. No, old man, I mean, we really should be jolly careful that they don't fall into the wrong hands. Well, it's far too late for that. If you're right, then Sir Donovan already has one.
Sir Donovan?
Castle looked at Grant without understanding for a long moment before comprehension dawned. Oh, him? Oh, he might well do something frightful with it, I've no doubt, but I wasn't really talking about Sir Donovan. I meant the British government. If a war office swallows were able to lay hands on one of those blue buses, well, and one of those blunderbusses, well, that would be very, very bad. Grant, whose belief in the ruling powers, with the exception of the Home Office's attachment to maintaining police forces around the country, was touchingly uncritical, said, Why? Because they might throw some scientist at it and possibly, just possibly, understand how they work. And if they manage that, it's a short step to making their own. And if they manage that, well, stick a lightning gun into the hands of every fella in a red tunic and bigger examples aboard every ship in the fleet, and it would be carnage. You can see that, can't you? No. I'd trust the British with them before I would anyone else. That's as may be, but you shouldn't trust them either. Think of all the scores to settle. How long before France is scorched cinder? How long before the United States is part of the Empire again, whether it likes the idea or not, eh? That wouldn't be so, wouldn't it? Can you guarantee it? Grant opened his mouth and then shut it again. He could not.
We have seen your future, Mr. Grant, said Miss Trent. There will be weapons to rival the lightning guns soon enough. Do not be in a hurry to risk your tomorrows. If we have any, said Miss Church, what are we going to do about Sir Donovan and his allies? They might do anything, and if they do it before we're ready, the future may be a very terrible place.
Grant rose and returned to the window. Twitching back the half-height neck curtain with a fingertip, he looked down into the street and at their lone observer, currently to be found pretending to read a newspaper. Well, he said, we could always just ask them. It is traditional upon introducing a minor player in a drama to then spend some paragraphs detailing a brief biography of the debutante. In the case of Gypsy McMahon, this would be a wasted effort beyond taking a moment to explain that Gypsy was an epithet bestowed upon him indirectly by a prison warder who observed that in a more civilized age, McMahon would have ended up swinging in a gibbet and therefore saved everyone a lot of trouble. After a brief period of being called Gibbet by his associates, the nickname metamorphosed into the handier form of Gypsy, and he was glad enough to adopt this and claim it for his own in preference to his given name, which was Horace. Gypsy McMahon had been told to keep an eye on the house in Kensington, and particularly on the comings and goings of Madame Trent, whom he was set to follow should she show her face. The last sentinel of the house had been met with opprobrium and harsh commentary on his return to Barking for failing to see her leave the previous day, and Gypsy had no desire to provoke the ire of his employer in a similar manner, especially given the high promises of what success would bring to those who proved trustworthy. After all, the boss had a rougher temper on him when provoked, or even when unprovoked. It was too easy to lose his favor and very hard to reacquire it. Gipsy had managed to stay in Sir Donovan's good graces to date by the simple expedient of total unquestioning obedience. It was a simple, effective strategy, and it seemed to work, and so Gipsy, who was fond of simple, effective strategies, was diligent in his submission to the boss and to his whims. And so, we find Gipsy lurking behind his unread newspaper, observing the windows he knew to belong to the rooms of Madame Trent, and below them, those of William Grant, as well as the door. He thought he had seen the net curtains of one of the upper story's windows twitch some 20 minutes previous, but otherwise there had been little excitement that day, and he was looking forward to being relieved in just over an hour. That prospect abruptly diminished when he saw Madame Trent and the company of another young lady whose identity was unknown to him leave the house, cross the road to his side, and then walk away from him. Nonchalantly tucking his newspaper under his arm and lighting a cigarette as a small compensation for the unlooked for likely lengthening of his shift, he sauntered after them in lukewarm pursuit. The two women were behaving in a manner he characterized as shifty, and this added flavor to the hunt. Why else would two young ladies be projecting an aura of the clandestine unless they were up to no good? And why would he, a criminal even unto the third generation, not find himself inflamed by professional curiosity to discover what that might be? Thus, he was positively agog when the women made a sudden turn down a back alley. He followed them for some 20 yards down the alleyway when, after a brief discussion, his prey halted and turned to face him. This was a surprising and unhappy development for Gipsy, although not nearly as surprising and unwelcome as the distinct feeling of a gun barrel pressing into the small of his back and the words whispered in a male voice and in a tone that did not betoken the prospect of negotiations. "Make any trouble and I'll shoot you clean through the backbone." Gipsy very slowly raised his hands and said, "No trouble for me, mate." The man simply appeared at Bradley's desk. Only the moment before Bradley had cast a wary eye across the office and seen nothing of interest, looked down at the report he was writing, and in the time it took him to finagle the spelling of necessarily into something more likely to please the staff of the Oxford English Dictionary's editorial board, the man somehow coalesced before him. He was more an urban than an urbane gentleman, possessed of an open, somewhat bland countenance, and a pleasant mind, dressed in a decently tailored, albeit off-the-rack suit, and an inoffensive hat, which he held in his hand. He smiled at Bradley, as if about to ask him for a charitable donation. Bradley rose. "I'm sorry, sir, you caught me in a brown study. Detective Sergeant Bradley, how might I help you?" My name is, Jowett? Geoffrey Jowett. I explained my business to the sergeant at the front desk, and he sent me to you." Bradley absorbed this information, and given that many of his tasks to date for the Metropolitan Force, and therefore the reputation by which the sergeant would know him, were to do with personation and fraud, he theorized that the man was here with a story of deception and chicanery. He invited Mr. Jowett to sit and to tell him his woes. "I am the secretary of a small society, small, but I like to think possessed of a membership of unusual intelligence and perceptiveness. The society is called the Metaphysical Investigation Conference, and it is our business to investigate the nature and limits of
reality.
Bradley blinked. He'd rather been hoping for a tale of misappropriated Christmas club savings or similar. How so? He asked for lack of anything more intelligent or insightful to say. Mr. Jowett smiled beatifically.
There is a belief in some quarters that all of the corners of our existence are well enough understood in the modern age. We beg to disagree. While science has indeed made remarkable strides in recent years, we hold that there is still so much more than is even guessed at. To that end, we have recruited everyone from philosophers to physicists, conjurers to chemists, and even a couple of members who regard themselves as true magicians. Decent fellows, though they do insist on spelling magic with a K, mind you.
Quite a Catholic gathering? Said Bradley.
We prefer to think of it as eclectic, but yes, there are many schools of thought within our number. We meet once a month in the private dining room over the wine press in Soho, and such gatherings can get quite rambunctious, I may tell you.
He paled, aware that he may be giving the wrong impression.
Intellectually, you understand, voices are rarely raised.
Bradley nodded. I understand, sir. So, how may I help you?
Well, you see, we are not just a talking shop. When we placed the word investigation in the middle of our society's name, it was no empty promise. One of our main activities is to send our members out into the world to investigate and report back upon instances of phenomena that fall outside the usual. It is there, you see, we are most likely to find the actual ragged edges of our true reality.
Finally, Bradley understood why the sergeant had sent the inoffensive Mr. Jowett to him. When you say outside the usual, how exactly do you mean, sir?
Oh, well, I'm sure that you can guess. Incidences of the sort that have been noted historically ever since anyone decided to note anything. A ghost, curious manifestations, strange and unique creatures, communing with the dead, and so on. Things that are not at all fashionable in our scientific age, Detective Sergeant, and yet such reports continue to accumulate. We send our people out with open minds and clear eyes, no expectations one way or the other. Although invariably they return with disappointing news, although in the true spirit of the scientific method, no failure is ever disappointing in and of itself, only a realization that perhaps the shadows of our knowledge are not as deep as we might wish.
But something has emerged during one of these investigations? Asked Bradley, hoping to prod Mr. Jowett towards specifics.
No, not exactly. Let me assure you, Detective Sergeant, that we are not naive in our endeavors. We know full well that the vast majority of such reported phenomena shall turn out to have the most humdrum explanations. On the subject of communing with the dead, for example, we tend to rely on the conjurers in our number. They are adept at stagecraft and illusion, after all, and whenever we send them off to report upon this medium or that, they come back to tell us of fraud, or even more distressingly, delusion far more often than not, but not consistently. There have been a handful of cases where there have been unable to explain what they witnessed. This, of course, does not preclude any number of mundane explanations, but it has certainly justified further investigation. Over the last 8 years since our formation, we have winnowed out a handful of truly remarkable individuals. If we could have but proved to a scientific certainty that their abilities were empirically sound, imagine what they would have meant.
Some color appeared in Mr. Jowett's cheeks as emotions lit in his breast. A great reorganizing of everything we know and everything we thought we knew. A vast leap forward for science as a whole new field to investigate. He subsided. That was our hope, a culmination of our little society's entire raison d'etre. Bradley noted Jowett's use of the past tense. What happened? Mr. Jowett shrugged a little hopelessly. They vanished. All of them. The absolute cream of England's finest mediumistic talents has vanished to a man and a woman. Bradley took a sharp pencil from the old cigar box in which he kept them, flicked open his notebook, and started writing a short summation of what he had just heard. Tell me, sir, he said as he wrote, has your society conducted any business with a woman calling herself Miss Cerulia Trent and her manager, a Mr. William Grant? Mr. Jowett seemed mildly startled. You know of Miss Trent? I deal with fraud and confidence trickery, sir, and you'll therefore understand that bogus mediums fall very much under my purview. I've just recently been looking at Miss Trent and Mr. Grant, but haven't yet arrived at any conclusions worthy of the name. I would be very interested in your view of them. Well, of course. Anything to help the police in their inquiries. Easy enough to remember specifics, as I maintain the Society's records, and it was an investigation with its interesting points. To it, it was the finding of the gentleman we sent along to one of Miss Trent's seances some months ago that she is not a true medium, although she is a remarkable performer for all that. There is a technique stage magicians use during so-called mentalist acts wherein they elicit information from their volunteers without seeming to do so. A technique called cold reading a subject. Miss Trent is an absolute master of it, able to piece together whole biographies from very few clues with a very high degree of accuracy. Indeed, our man was so impressed that he declined to call her a fraud, saying instead that she may still be of interest to the society, albeit not in the category that we had first assumed, given her profession. What then? Well, a mind reader. A literal mind reader. If not that, then she is the very luck of the devil. For many of her intuitive leaps were based upon markedly thin foreknowledge, and yet were of remarkable accuracy. She couldn't have researched her sitters beforehand? Of course, and every fraud does. But we make a point of trying to introduce changes to the attendant sitters, and Amen himself is known to the medium until the first time he or she claps eyes upon them at the sitting. If there is foreknowledge being gained by some unknown method, that method itself is extraordinary and deserving of investigation. Bradley studied his notes and then looked seriously at Mr. Jowett. To return to your reason for coming here today, you are in effect reporting multiple missing persons? Oh, no, not really. I'm sure most, if not all, have already been reported. But you see, not all are in London or even the home countries, or even the home counties. It was the feeling of the Society's committee that we are probably the only people aware that there is a clear pattern here, that the missing are all of a feather. In which case, we could not possibly fail to pass on that knowledge to the authorities. Something is afoot, and it seems unlikely that whatever it is bodes well for the missing people. Indeed, it may already be too late for them. Too late? What makes you say that? Because we found one of them. Mr. Jowett grimaced like a concerned pug. A remarkable young man by the name of Winston Barnaby, 22 years of age, the son of a North Finchley butcher. I shan't go into his bona fides beyond saying he'd undergone 2 rounds of tacit investigation from first one and then the other of our resident stage magicians, and on the second occasion, one of our magic, with a K, magicians also attended. Both of the former gentlemen reported that they could find no trace of the mountebank in Mr. Barnaby's conduct, which the latter declared Barnaby emanated arcane energies, whatever that means. And Mr. Barnaby was later found dead. Jowett shook his head. No, we found him a resident, likely a permanent resident, I am told, of Colney Hatch, which is to say, the lunatic asylum. And that is the end of chapter 9.